Good morning. I want to bring you greetings in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I am Aria Kirkland-Harris, and I am the Washington, D.C. Regional Director at the Expectations Project, where we believe that all of God's children, no matter their race, ethnicity, their zip code, all of God's children deserve an amazing education. And our mission is to empower people of faith to shine a light on education inequality and close the achievement gap through prayer, compassionate service, and faithful advocacy. Now, I've had the privilege of partnering with the Baltimore-Washington Conference and the Greater Washington District. I see my community family in the back there. And I just wanted to thank you all for your commitment to service and your dedication to education, because the love that I've experienced in being in partnership with you all is so real, and I just wanted to continue to thank you for that ministry. And so, as I mentioned, at the Expectations Project, we partner with congregations around education inequality in 3 ways. We partner in prayer to pray for our schools and our students and our teachers, for our district leaders and policymakers. We work through compassionate service and help churches strengthen their school partnerships and those ministries that provide tutoring and mentoring and food programs. And the third thing that we do is what we call faithful advocacy, and that's where we develop faith-based campaigns that call for the policy and practice shifts that we believe will help bring systemic change in our public education system. And that's where I want to hang out with you this morning in this faithful advocacy piece, because I am very excited to share that we are launching a trauma-informed schools campaign. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that means. And in the spirit of telling stories, I want to share some of my stories from my classroom with you to talk about why trauma-informed schools are so important. There are over 16 million children in this country living in poverty. And research shows that by the time they reach the 4th grade, they are already 3 grade levels behind their wealthier peers. Children in poverty, only 50% of children living in poverty go on to graduate from high school. And when they do graduate, they're coming out with 8th grade skills. And so then it's no surprise that from kids living in poverty, only 1 in 10 will go on to college. And so those statistics put together are what we refer to as the academic achievement gap. And as Christians who love God and serve a Lord who loves justice and demands that we care for and protect and nurture our children, the existence of this achievement gap leaves us with some tough issues that we have to grapple with. And so when I began teaching, and one of my mentors asked me, how are you going to talk about the solvability of the education achievement gap? Because these statistics are so staggering. And this work is tough, and you will get discouraged and have doubts. So how are you going to hold on to that hope and believe that this is a solvable issue? And I simply say that we have to believe that this is solvable because there are real children behind these statistics. There are kids in our classrooms who need our support and our love and encouragement and our dedication. And so are there any teachers in the room? Past educators, veterans? Can we give them a round of applause, please? I think you all can speak to the same truth that I speak, that teaching is hard work. It's incredibly rewarding to be charged with the care and the development of our children and to see them grow and thrive, but it's also hard, especially in those first few years. And so I just want to thank you. You all love on your teachers, encourage them, because it's important work. And so in my first few years of teaching, as I was working out, figuring out how to do classroom management and to get my kids to pay attention to me and figure all the details out, I started, starting to understand the challenges that they were facing. I taught preschool, and so one of the best things about preschool is that the kids take naps. And so it's a beautiful thing, right? You have 16 little people sleeping all around you, and you feel like you've done something right that day. But there was one day in the spring that one of my girls, we'll call her Cece for these purposes, just wouldn't go to sleep. And so it's nap time, and everyone's asleep except for her. And she's sitting up on her mat and kind of playing around with things, but she was quiet and wasn't bothering anyone, and she was looking at me, and I was looking at her, and I was like, okay, if you stay quiet, I'm gonna leave you alone because I'm tired today. I don't have the energy to do this. And then a few minutes later, I hear a tapping noise, and she was flipping her mat up and down. But still, like everyone was asleep, she was quiet. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I was like, okay, I'm watching you, but just stay quiet. But of course that didn't work, because a few minutes later, I see her swinging her mat around in the air like this. And so I said, okay, it's time to, get up and see what's going on here. And so I walk over to her and I take her mat and put it on the floor and I say, Cece, it's time to go to sleep. And she looks at me and then turns and makes a beeline for our dramatic play area. And for those of you who aren't familiar with preschool, that's the area where we have the kitchen sets and the stove and the little dining room set so kids can kind of play house. And so she walks over there and I follow her. And she stands and looks at me and I look at her, still quiet, and then she kicks a chair. And so I put it back, and then she walks over to a bookshelf and starts throwing the books on the floor. And I'm still standing there watching her and just thinking, what's going on here? What is she about to do? All the other kids are asleep and I'm in here by myself. Lord, what am I supposed to do here? And so I was praying about what to do for my student as she was going through this, whatever tantrum scenario that she was going through. And I heard in a very clear and still small voice to sit down and watch her. And so I did that. I pulled out a chair and sat in front of her and watched as she continued to pull all the toys off the shelf and flipping over tables and chairs. And then it got to a point where she had pulled everything out of its place. And then she came and sat down at my feet and she looked at me and I looked back at her and I asked her, "Are you done?" And she nodded yes, and I said, "Now put everything back." And so she went and took every single book, every toy, and put it back in its right place. I helped her with the heavier objects. But then when we got back, she came back to me and she was finished cleaning up. I said, "Okay, let's go." We went to her mat, I covered her up, and she went to sleep. And now I say all of this pretty in a methodical and calm way, but this went on for about a half an hour. And I was tired and frustrated and somewhat angry, not knowing what to do, and so I went for a walk. I had someone cover my classroom, and I went for a walk to try to kind of gather myself. And as I walked around the school, I noticed that there were children everywhere crying. There were a group of kids outside of the principal's office who had been put out of class for being disruptive. There was a bench full in front of the nurse's office because kids were crying and saying that they didn't feel well. There were kids coming out of the cafeteria and their teachers were looking angry and frustrated like I was. And I was just wondering, what is going on today? Why are all of our children crying? And so I made my way back to my classroom and my kids were waking up. And so I said, we're going to have a quiet afternoon because Miss Kirkland-Harris is tired. And so I took out a book. It was called One Duck Stuck. If you have kids, it's a great book. It's full of rhyming words and animals helping each other. But this book is called One Duck Stuck. And so when we finished reading it, I asked, okay, can someone tell me a word that rhymes with duck? And one of my boys raised his hand and he said, "Oh, truck rhymes with duck." And I said, "Very good." And another little boy in true 3-year-old fashion said, "Oh, my daddy has a truck." I was like, okay, well, that's not what we're talking about, but tell me about your daddy's truck. And he said, "Well, he crashed it." And I was like, "Well, how did he crash it?" And he said, "The police were chasing him and they made him crash it." And I said, okay. And then another child raises their hand and says, "Oh, the police came to my house last night when the firecrackers were going off, and mommy told me to get under the bed." And then another child says, "Oh, I don't like the police." And I said, "Well, why?" "Because they tell you to get on the ground and they lock you up." And then another boy looks at my little girl, Cece, and says, "Oh, Cece's daddy is locked up." And I paused and I looked at her and I said, "Is that true?" And she nodded yes. And I said, "Has he come home yet?" And she said no. And I said, "Well, is your mommy okay?" And she said yes. And I was floored because these are my kids, my children that I say that I love and I care for them every day, but I had no idea what was going on in their lives. Yeah. It turns out that there had been a big fight in the neighborhood the day before, and all of our kids had been outside and seen it, and shots were fired, the police were called, and our students saw all of this turmoil in their communities, and they brought all that weight and that heaviness into school with them. And as a teacher, I was not prepared to give them what they needed, and I was angry. Our kids are heavy laden and burdened, and I pray that that's what Jesus means when he says, "Come to me, all of you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Our children are carrying these weights of the environments that they're in. They're highly stressful environments. When you are hungry, or when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, where you don't know where you're going to sleep at night, when your parents disappear and you don't know where they've gone, of course you are going to be stressed out. That's why the kids were crying all over the school. And so that's why we believe that people of faith can make a difference on these issues. That's why we're saying we need to have trauma-informed schools. The Center for Disease Control calls these adverse childhood experiences, these traumatic experiences that cause toxic stress. And we have to give our kids the tools that they need to cope with these stressors. And we know that this works because we do it in our own churches, right? We have HIV/AIDS ministries for people who are dealing with that type of burden. We have grief share and divorce care because we know that death and divorce and families and turmoil impact our kids. And so if we can do those things in our churches, why can't we do them in our schools? And so that's what I'm asking you to do here today. Continue to do what you're doing with your school partnerships, provide meals for kids, be tutors and mentors, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. At the same time, be advocates for our children to make sure that teachers have the training that they need to identify trauma and respond to it effectively. Make sure that our schools have the right budget so they can hire the necessary social workers and counselors and psychologists. And most importantly, join us to advocate to end these zero-tolerance discipline practices that disproportionately suspend and expel the kids who are dealing with these issues. We have to stop pushing them out into the streets where they experienced this trauma in the first place. There are real things that we can do, and so we're asking you to join the Expectations Project. Our website is www.expectations.org. We'll be sharing more information with you about trauma-informed schools, and just because we have hope that our children can be healthy and happy and thrive. And so I thank you for your time and pray that all will be well for the rest of the day. Thank you.